Bethesda started responding to some of the Starfield and Shattered Space pushback. And there's really two parts of this. First, just an interview that was done with Games Radar that does touch on many of the controversial topics being discussed in the community. But then, as a result of how negative some of the community reactions were to that initial response, we actually got a response to the response and even further clarification. And honestly, I wasn't even going to make this video, but I saw a lot of bad takes out there on this one, so I wanted to weigh in myself, because I think some of what Bethesda is saying here reflects a complete disconnect with their fans, while some of the other aspects of this commentary is just being blown out of proportion. But what kicked this all off is just recently Emil, the design director at Bethesda, did an interview with Games Radar Plus, where he talks about both Starfield and Shattered Space, and one of the main quotes getting fans up in arms is this: "I think in a lot of ways, Starfield is the hardest thing Bethesda has ever done. We pushed ourselves to make something totally different, to just jam into an Xbox the biggest, richest space simulation RPG anyone could imagine. That we pulled it off makes Starfield something of a technical marvel. It's also, in a lot of ways, the best game we've ever made. But for us, most importantly, Starfield has its own unique personality and now sits right next to Fallout and Elder Scrolls." And well, honestly, yeah, I have a lot to say about even what was just said there. Emil does continue on, saying, "Starfield is developing its own unique fan base. It's big and it's growing. Bethesda used to feel like the studio of Elder Scrolls, that it was the studio you'd associate with Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Now it's Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Starfield. Bethesda Game Studios' Big Three." As you can probably imagine, a lot of people had issues with what was said during this. There was lots of pushback online. I'm sure many of you watching right now feel the same way. And even just on the comment of Starfield now being a part of the Big Three with the Elder Scrolls and Fallout, Games Radar, the outlet that literally conducted this interview, waited about a week, then posted an opinion piece that disagreed with what Emil said during his interview with Games Radar. So yeah, there's obviously some people disagreeing with this, and I'm definitely one of them. On the side of Starfield being an incredibly difficult game for Bethesda, I honestly get that. With Fallout and the Elder Scrolls, you almost have a rough blueprint that you're able to follow during development. Immediately, you can fill in a ton of blanks with information thanks to some of the past games, as well as the established lore for that franchise. But when it comes to making Starfield, you have none of that. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that fans were hotly debating what features we can expect from Starfield. I personally didn't expect the big space game to have any kind of spaceflight, because it's Bethesda. They don't typically do that kind of stuff. So for Bethesda to turn around and say that yes, developing this one was hard and that it is a technical marvel makes perfect sense to me. I have no issues with that. And I mean, even in just objective terms, this game was worked on for about 8 years. That's a lot of time to spend on a video game for Bethesda Game Studios. So I do cut Emil some slack here, because I think what he's trying to say is that Starfield in a lot of ways is the best game Bethesda has ever made, particularly from a technical standpoint. They've done things with this game that they have never done or even really attempted with some of their other games. And well, yeah, I can cut Emil some slack and I understand what he was going for. It's still a quote that makes you shake your head. Like, you have to know that saying Starfield is the best game we've ever made is going to get some pushback. Because yeah, the game's been incredibly controversial for the past year. Fans very obviously don't agree that this is the best you can do. And then continuing further to say it's right up there as a part of the Big Three, while many fans are literally begging for you to move on from this one, will also of course lead to more controversy. Many fans are actively concerned about what's going to happen with the Elder Scrolls 6 as a byproduct of some of the major decisions Bethesda's making with Starfield. So then quotes like this are definitely concerning, because they don't want you to continue in this direction, they want you to go into a different direction. And yeah, this is obviously a debated point. Some people like Starfield a lot more than some others, and that's fine. But I think just even overall, it's easy to see when fan feedback is looking like this, that saying this is the best game ever is never really going to be a great look with the majority of your fan base. And the next quote only makes things a little bit worse. Any Bethesda developer who has been around since the Horse Armor days knows that by this point, if we understand one thing, it's DLC. That's not to say we're on autopilot and don't think about it now. It means we still think about it and have probably thought about it more than any other studio since those early days. And I think the result of all of that contemplating is that we have a pretty good handle on how to plug new content into our huge games. And like, for me personally, I take issue with some of these quotes on several different levels. Emil cites the horse armor days as if they were some distant memory, saying that if you've been around since those, you'll see we have this DLC thing figured out by now. But the reality is, Bethesda is still doing horse armor, and if anything, it seems like a core aspect of Bethesda's strategy going forward is to make more horse armor. If you're not familiar, the origins of this horse armor meme was a $2.50 DLC for Oblivion that simply added in horse armor. At the time, fans were angry at the cost to content ratio, many considering a DLC that only adds in horse armor for $2.50 to be a major ripoff, and even just in the content side. This is not the type of content we want from an individual DLC. And like, yeah, there was obviously a point in the middle there where Bethesda probably took the lessons from that, but recently they've been bought up by Microsoft and are fully in on this type of content. The Bethesda of 2024 is selling a $70 game that you can buy early access to, but once you're actually in-game, buy plushie sets for $3, or hey, maybe a singular outfit for $4. But if you want a full-on spacesuit, you'll have to whip out your wallet with the $5 premium. But if you're looking for something a bit cheaper, there's some weapon skins for a mere $3 as well. Or hey, how about an entirely new quest to add it into the game? Don't worry, that'll just be $5. And I think most fans out there feel that a lot of this stuff is worse than that $2 horse armor. And it doesn't really seem like Bethesda has evolved much from the horse armor days, particularly when it comes to some of these DLCs. So yeah, this quote from Emil here just seems completely tone deaf to me. This is one of the big controversies surrounding your games right now. These paid mods being ridiculously priced for the amount of content they're delivering, so then to specifically call back to one of the times you sold something and fans didn't agree to show how much you know about DLC does feel very disconnected. And just overall, saying that if there's one thing Bethesda understands, it's DLC, in response to a DLC release that was met with poor critical reviews and overwhelmingly negative fan reviews, when it comes to both the content as well as the price of that DLC, just feels bad. Look, in fairness to Emil, we don't know exactly when this interview took place, so we could have been talking about these things prior to seeing some of the Shattered Space feedback, and in that sense, I cut him some slack. But the interview was posted after Shattered Space released, and even in other responses, we're hearing a similar story. If folks haven't played Shattered Space and they like Starfield, I think they're missing out. If folks have played Shattered Space and still don't like it, that makes me sad, honestly. Just know that we've also been hearing from plenty of people who love it. We'll talk more about this tweet later. It's a part of Emil's response to some of the responses from this interview on Games Radar, but taking those two responses together, it feels like Bethesda is ignoring the criticism, or at least Emil is. In this interview and other interviews, we hear how Shattered Space was made in response to fan feedback. Well, it seems like the sad reality is it didn't work. Both fans and critics alike are still not really connecting with this content. And if anything, it seems like Shattered Space has only worsened some of the fan criticism of Starfield overall. So then to hit back with, well, some people actually love it. It's like, okay, if you love Shattered Space, that's great. Having fun with a video game shouldn't be something we have to defend, and sadly, yes, many people do have to deal with that when it comes to Starfield, but at the same time, Shattered Space isn't connecting with the masses from all of the available data I can see. And Bethesda's response here feels a lot more like putting on the blinders and saying that they make great DLCs, or that people are loving their DLCs. Meanwhile, a lot of people seemingly don't love this DLC. And really, I don't see any major acknowledgement of that here, no recognition of some of this fan pushback around the type of content being released. And reading into some of these quotes, it really does feel like this attitude is enraging some parts of the fandom. Because for a lot of people, after reading these quotes and being so upset about what happened with Shattered Space, they just feel like Bethesda is saying, we know better than you, and they aren't hearing the criticisms or the feedback. And in some ways, the rest of the interview only serves to reinforce that. We broke from our established formula of give the player a giant landmass and let them wander around and explore tons of specific handcrafted content. In Starfield, you have giant landmasses and tons of handcrafted content, but not together. And that's something a lot of folks missed. So admittedly, I'm a bit unsure on this one. I can't tell if Emil is saying missed as in they didn't realize the handcrafted content was there, or instead means missed in the sense that Shattered Space will be bringing giant landmasses and handcrafted content in one spot, and players have missed having that type of content, which, yeah, I would agree with that part. If it means missed in that the players didn't see it, I don't think people missed it, I just don't think they liked the style of content from Starfield that much. Starfield has an ungodly amount of content. It feels like a giant game, but at around 60 to 70 hours, I think many players hit this wall where the consistent fast traveling and the lack of traditional Bethesda game studios exploration becomes annoying. I felt it, lots of reviews talk about it, and well, yeah, it may just be my own stupid opinion. I still wasn't confused about the fact that there was more content out there. I saw the unfinished quests in my journal, and in reality, I just didn't want to play them anymore. Shattered Space is a response to those players, so Bethesda was gracious enough to keep it nice and simple for us and put all of that content in one place. While it doesn't change Starfield as a whole, it does offer this really unique place that players can go in order to get that experience. This is all post-release stuff aimed at giving fans more of what they deserve. But I think we are seeing the fact that Bethesda isn't exactly understanding why players aren't happy with Starfield. Because even in their attempted response, or giving players what content they deserve, the players still weren't super happy with what they got. And some of these other quotes definitely back up the idea that there is a disconnect here. Emil goes on to speak about Fallout 3's definitive ending before DLC. Because without Broken Steel, Fallout 3 will just be over once you beat the game. The Broken Steel DLC is what allowed you to keep playing after the end. And Emil takes this as a lesson that connects to Bethesda's evolving design philosophy. And that was really the moment we realized that our fans don't want to play our games. They want to live in the worlds we create. That means their experiences never end, and the content, whatever it is, works together as seamlessly as we can make it. And they definitely are onto something with that. We keep hearing about these 10-year plans for Bethesda games, and clearly Starfield was made with that in mind. This game has an absurd amount of content, likely the biggest Bethesda Game Studios game ever, and many systems that you can spend hours in, and modders can spend thousands of hours improving. But I think Emil is partially missing it here. It's about living in a lived-in world, one that truly feels alive. I think Emil and the broader team at Bethesda Game Studios are pumping out content for these games. They want Fallout 76 to exist forever, and a big talking point before Starfield's release was how they needed to prepare for people playing these games for 10 years now. To Bethesda, that largely just seems to mean more content. Get in as many quests as possible, and we saw that with the insane amount of content in Starfield, it'll really take a good 30 hours to get into this game and open up all of the major mechanics as well as faction quest lines. It is a giant game, but even despite the fact that Starfield is objectively giant, I would bet for many players out there, they're going to have more hours played on Skyrim or Fallout 4 than Starfield. And I think the big reason for that is both Skyrim and Fallout 4 just feel so much more alive. One of the issues with Starfield is the world does kind of feel like it only ever exists around you. This is likely a byproduct of the consistent fast traveling, as you literally are deloading the cells, but as I was playing through Shattered Space, it just consistently felt like I was the most important person in the room at all times. Everything was about me, and that extends to the rest of Starfield as well. Fallout 4 and Skyrim do a much better job at having the world continue to live without you. The people, places, and overall world just genuinely feel alive. People are scared of walking around certain areas because Deathclaws are there. And yeah, you can literally go there and then get massacred by Deathclaws if you want to. Starfield doesn't have a Quarry Junction, or even to a greater extreme, blowing up Megaton. And while of course these aren't the only examples, it does feel like Starfield is missing that feeling. I don't enjoy Fallout 4 more than Starfield because there are more stories in Fallout 4. It's the depth of the stories being told by each of these respective games. The different paths, and more importantly, how alive some of the characters feel in Fallout 4 is what draws me in for a subsequent playthrough. In Fallout 4, a lot of the quests have you just as a character in someone else's story. Like during the Cabot House questline, you are introduced into this wacky, never-aging family, so pretty quickly it feels like you're thrust into something, and you have feelings about all of these major characters. They are the main characters of their story, and we're really just here along for the ride. I think in a lot of Starfield, those characters aren't shining nearly as bright for some reason. Like thinking about this game, outside of the companions, there aren't any major characters that stood out to me. A lot of the people in Starfield just kind of blend together when I think about it. And I would ask you that same question. How many non-companion NPCs can you readily name from Starfield? Now think about the same thing for Fallout or the Elder Scrolls, and I imagine that number is going to be very different. So as you likely saw, all of this was said, and the community had some pretty strong reactions to all of it. And I get this. Lots of these quotes were portrayed somewhat out of context. taking the most incendiary lines and having them posted somewhere where nobody is realistically reading what else was said around it. But even for me, I did find some of this stuff bothersome, and as somebody who was disappointed with Shattered Space, none of these responses made me feel like Bethesda would be doing better, even just evolving anytime soon. And instead, I think a lot of Bethesda's responses here felt like they're insisting they know what's right and the players are wrong for not enjoying it. And I mean, that isn't baseless. This was literally the company responding to negative Steam reviews for Starfield less than 1 year ago. Just in principle, I think responding to negative reviews is kind of an odd thing in gaming. At the end of the day, if you like or dislike a game is quite subjective. So the fact that Bethesda was almost trying to what felt like correct those reviews was odd to a lot of people. And I think overall, many of these recent quotes to come out of this Emil interview did serve to fuel the fire and even just increase fan frustration with Bethesda overall. So one fan asked about all of that, taking to Twitter to literally just respond to Emil and explain their perspective as a fan, how they felt some of the interview responses were fairly tone deaf, with Bethesda patting themselves on the back while many reviews are quite negative for the DLC, with the overall message being that fans want to see Bethesda game studios and Starfield succeed, but these responses don't make it seem like they're learning from their mistakes. And Emil actually responded, which right off the bat is amazing to me. A dev simply responding to a fan who is taking out the time to lay out their frustrations is exactly what we need more of. And even if I don't agree with Emil's response fully, I really appreciate that he did respond, because it would be a lot easier to just ignore this. First, the interview. As the design director, sometimes I'm asked or instructed to do interviews. I was happy to do that, to represent the designers and the studio. Seeing how hard and passionately they worked on Shattered Space, they deserve nothing less. Optimism and excitement are pretty standard for interviews, and I'm generally pretty optimistic and excitable about games by nature. That said, my optimism is in no way meant to be a mud in the eye of any dissatisfied fan. That's not how it works. I'm also very proud of Shattered Space. We all are. Most of the quests and levels were done by designers who have worked on previous Bethesda games and DLCs, going all the way back to Morrowind. They're good at what they do, and it shows. If folks haven't played Shattered Space and they like Starfield, I think they're missing out. If folks have played Shattered Space and still don't like it, that makes me sad, honestly. Just know that we've been hearing from plenty of people who love it. Maybe it's a game of expectations. Fans want a lot, and we do all we can to accommodate them. Here's what I can tell you. Nobody, and I mean nobody at Bethesda, is patting themselves on the back while ignoring our players. In addition to Shattered Space, we've also spent a lot of time this year addressing community concerns and making fixes. We'll continue to do so, and we'll be listening to our fans every step of the way. We make these games for all of you. Starfield is a massive game, and it takes time for us to address things. We move as fast as we can, as safely as we can. Game development is always tricky, but with the game as big as Starfield, every fix could potentially break something else. To close, let me just say, I love games, I love Bethesda games. I've been playing them since the Terminator days. All I or anyone here wants to do is make those games and to make them better. No ego, no arrogance, just a lot of hard work and appreciation for our fans. And I do think this response to the response was a lot better. Emil doesn't really say much of anything here, but I think overall it feels like the fan frustrations are being heard, and that is enough for a lot of people out there. But I do wonder how much of this is Bethesda proclaiming they hear the feedback while not really having plans to change much. Like, yeah, sure, Starfield will still get updates, but the core game isn't getting an overhaul as far as I can tell. So while Emil does say, we've also spent a lot of time this year addressing community concerns and making fixes, we'll continue to do so, and we'll be listening to our fans every step of the way. Like, yeah, that all sounds good, but the point of interest system, one of the single largest complaints about this game, remains exactly the same from release more or less. Like, yeah, cool, there are now buggies, which makes getting to the points of interest a lot faster, but a year later, this principal complaint about the game is still a principal complaint about the game. So yeah, they're hearing the fan feedback, that's good, but it only really matters if some of the problems are fixed. And Emil does touch on that, mentioning how Starfield is a massive game, so it does take time to address things. But how long are we supposed to wait? It's not like Bethesda is being particularly vocal about what else will be changing, so are fans just meant to cross their fingers and hope their particular complaints get addressed one day? I think the reality is Bethesda isn't going to invest the budget to justify something like a Cyberpunk 2.0 overhaul for Starfield, and why would they? And with what I found to be one of the most impactful statements from this response, nobody, and I mean nobody at Bethesda, is patting themselves on the back while ignoring our players. And like, yeah, it's a good response, but there's also not much acknowledgement of the concerns, criticisms, or feedback in general. So you could say we're not ignoring the players, but you're also not really acknowledging the players that much. One of the first times Bethesda ever mentioned hearing about fan feedback and actually bringing some design changes to Starfield was during the marketing push for the DLC. Like, Bethesda did do a really good job at laying out their planned feature additions for 2024. That was a great piece of communication. I really hope they do the exact same thing for 2025. But when it comes to responding to feedback and hearing the feedback, a lot of people had a lot of complaints about Starfield. The fan reviews were negative for a long time. The first time we heard about them changing things going forward was when they were trying to sell us something new. It was when pre-orders went up for Shattered Space that they started announcing, oh yeah, we heard that you didn't like the spread out systems aspect. At no point was there an acknowledgement that something was going to change in the base game, but instead they were just giving us the opportunity to buy something new that is supposedly going to be better, but we're not going to give you reviews first, so you'll just have to buy it and find out for yourself. I mean, that's not to say that Bethesda isn't actively working on making Starfield a better game. I'm sure there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people working on this, or who have worked on this, where their main and really only goal was to make this a better experience for players. But I think we are running into a problem with the community where things are getting down to hope versus reality when it comes to Starfield. I don't think a big overhaul is coming to this game unless it comes from modders, and I think for a lot of players out there, the only way they really want to come back and love Starfield, at least as much as the Elder Scrolls and Fallout, is if Starfield gets a big overhaul. So it kind of creates the situation where there will never be enough. There's no update that's going to come in 2025 that's going to win back your support for Starfield if you don't already like what they're doing. And I can see how that could be incredibly frustrating from Bethesda's perspective, where they feel like they can never do enough to make some of the fans happy. And if you can never make those fans happy, just start relying on feedback from the fans who already like the game, because yeah, you can actually make them happier. The next few updates for Starfield will be criticized because they're just going to be typical game updates. They'll fix bugs, they'll add in a new feature or two, but expecting more than that, particularly outside of the next DLC, I think is just unrealistic. If you're interested in some more Bethesda content that isn't quite as negative, check out this video.